So yesterday we talked about how the parties were evolving, and that's what the bell ringer is about. And of course, in the modern day, the median ads play a big role. So that's what the previous activity was about. So hopefully you have submitted that document. Make sure that you do that. It's back under the heading political ads. And you should just be able to click the submit button and submit that document. Just remember to check, make sure that you have 3 facts for each of the ads and 1 interpretation for each.
Yeah, I'm going to have that make from president thing stuck in my head all day.
Yeah, some of the ads are repetitive on purpose to try to make you remember the person's name. That was more of a thing they did in the past, though. But going back to the notes here, we had talked about the big parties, so let's talk about third parties. And there are a few different types of third parties that exist. The first one of those are ideological parties. And that is a party with a philosophy or way of thinking that impacts many issues. So they have a specific philosophy that they'd like to follow. So an example of that would be, for instance, communists or socialists. They're both examples of ideological parties. They have a specific way of thinking that they've basically borrowed from Karl Marx. Another example would be the Libertarian Party. This one actually gets 2 to 3% of the vote in presidential elections, so they're probably the most sizable third party that exists. So they believe in minimal government. And then the next type of party that exists would be those that focus on economic issues. So the next type focuses on economic issues. And so these ones obviously concentrate on issues involving money, finance. Oops. And the last type would, or the third type, excuse me, would be single issue parties. They obviously only concentrate on one issue. So, for instance, the Prohibition Party just concentrated on eliminating alcohol. And the next type would be a splinter party. A splinter party. And this is one that breaks off from or splinters, separates from one of the two big parties.
Would that make the Democrats and Republicans technically two big splinter parties?
I suppose from a long time ago, yes. Probably the biggest example would be Teddy Roosevelt, who ran for president under the Bull Moose Party in 1912. He didn't get the Republican nomination again, so he decided to break off and form his own party. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that this usually means is whatever party they break off from is probably going to lose. In fact, that's what happened in 1912. The Republicans and Teddy Roosevelt didn't end up winning. Instead, Woodrow Wilson did. But that isn't always true, because in 1948, Southerners broke off and formed their own party called the Dixiecrats. Obviously, their main issue was segregation. But despite that they broke off, Harry Truman, the regular Democrat, still ended up winning. So often when a splinter happens, it causes the party that they broke off from to lose, but it isn't necessarily guaranteed. When we look at organization of the parties, we often just think of the Republicans and Democrats as these big national organizations, but actually they do have meetings at the county and state level. So, for instance, there is a Crawford County Republican Party and a Pennsylvania Democratic Party that are separate actually from the bigger ones. There we go. There is a national committee that makes bigger decisions. You often heard them referred as the RNC or the DNC. And both of them have a chairperson. So you might think, oh, this is the most important person in the party, but that's not always true. Because often when the president is part of the same party, the president chooses the chairperson. So even though the Democratic Party has its own chairperson, right now they're basically going to do whatever Joe Biden says. When Trump was in office, the RNC chairperson, Ronna McDaniel, is going to do whatever President Trump said. Every 4 years, they have a convention to decide who the presidential candidate is going to be and what the party stands for. Of course, both those this last time around in 2020 were virtual for the most part. And now let's just look at elections. Elections. In the United States, we have more elections than anybody else because we have 2 sets of elections every year. And the first set of elections we always have are called the primaries. And these usually happen in the spring, although that can stretch out for a long time, sometimes February through September. They're different in each state, so not all the states hold them at the same time. Pennsylvania's, for instance, is usually a little bit later than everybody else's, but not the latest. And this is when the parties choose candidates. When the parties choose candidates. So, for instance, if you're registered to vote and this spring you go and you vote in the election, you'll see things like city council on there and school board. But all you're doing is actually whatever your party you're registered in, you're choosing which one of those people you're nominating to run for the office. In Pennsylvania, we have what are called a closed primary, which means you can only vote within your party. So if you're a Republican, you go and select which Republicans you want. If you're a Democrat, you go and vote for which Democrats you want. If you belong to anything else, chances are you have nothing to vote for during the primary. So if you're not affiliated, you're independent, then technically you won't be able to vote in the primary. And then there's the general election. The general election is held at the same time, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. The first Tuesday after the first Monday in November.
That seems complicated.
It does, doesn't it? So if you wake up, it's November 1st and it's a Tuesday, you might get excited like me and think, oh boy, there's an election today. But no, there's not, because it's not after the first Monday. So you have to wait until the next week. On this day, all voters choose who will hold the offices. All voters will choose who will hold the offices. So in November of this year, you'll then go and there'll be people that were nominated for city council for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and you will choose which one of these people that will hold office. Except actually, there'll be multiple seats. There's either 2 or 3 seats open. Does anybody know anyone on city council? All of you know at least one person on city council. Everybody know who that is? Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones is on the city council. So that would be an example of a local office. And then the presidential election. Now this one gets the most attention, obviously. The funny thing is it has one of the least impacts on our own lives. Like we spend a lot of time arguing about the presidency, but actually it has some of the least impact on us individually. Most of the impact that happens on us is local elections. But presidential elections is where most of our attention goes. So when running for president, first someone sets up what's called an exploratory committee. An exploratory committee. They get their friends together and they say, hey, how about you look into whether or not it's a good idea for me to run for president? Now, chances are they already have their mind made up, but some of them, of course, if their closest friends come to them and say, hey, this is a really bad idea, people hate you, some people will listen to that. Not everybody does, though. But once they make this announcement, there is a good chance that they're going to run. Then they visit the first states that hold primaries. And as of right now, and this could change, the first 2 states that hold them are New Hampshire and Iowa. So if you see your senator or your governor making a lot of camping trips to New Hampshire and Iowa, 2 places that not a lot of people are going to go, then that probably means they're looking into running for the presidency. Now, the reason why I say that could change is because other states could decide to move theirs up. A lot of people don't think it's right for Iowa and New Hampshire to go first. They're both very rural, mostly white, for instance, and so some people think more diverse states should go first. But the goal of any president is to gather as many delegates for the convention as possible. Gather as many delegates for the convention as possible. Because when you win a primary, what you actually win are delegates. For instance, if you win the Pennsylvania primary, and I can't remember the number of delegates, but let's say there's 230, and you get 50% of the primary vote in Pennsylvania, it means you get half of those delegates. And so once all these delegates show up at the convention, you need to have a majority. And then, of course, once they're nominated, then they get into the general election. And, of course, one of the big things that they do after their convention is they have debates, presidential debates. Now, these have been going on since 1960, and they're often televised. And they usually have 3 at this point, 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. It's a good chance to see what kind of leader they be, and what kind of information they have, and what their plans are. But unless they're disastrous, they usually don't have that much of an impact on the overall election, because pretty much they've been making campaign speeches saying these kind of things that they're already going to do anyway. So unless they come onto the stage and trip and fall down and accidentally say a swear word or something like that, or shoot a puppy or whatever that could possibly lose them votes.
Or call the current president serving a clown.
Yeah, so
Even if it might be deserved.
So those kind of things can cause harm to debates, but those rarely happen because they try to rehearse as much as possible. So for the remainder of the period, you can, of course, work on the reading or finish up those political ad activity if you haven't already done so.